Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Got one of those stories sent to me by everybody, and I got to correct the headline because the headline's off a little bit in this version of it. But this story hit the news a couple days ago. It's actually been going on for a while, but for some reason, it really hit the news recently. James Evenden wrote this for thesun.com. Dairy Queen owners hit with $6 million fine over a little-known law regarding pay, which they said they never knew. Now, it's not a $6 million fine. There were lawsuits that totaled $6 million by the time they were done, and it resulted from a little-known law involving paychecks. So the owners of a Dairy Queen in Long Island were slapped with $6 million. It says here fines, but this is actually money from lawsuits, for paying their employees every 2 weeks instead of weekly. Now, it's a franchise, of course, DQ, and it's owned by Sisters. It's said to have violated a New York pay frequency law that dates all the way back to the Great Depression. The Sisters bought the Dairy Queen after they pooled all of their money together, and then one lawsuit filed in 2019 put them at risk of homelessness. It turned out the pair were unknowingly breaking the state's frequency of pay law, which was established during the Depression to prevent wage theft. The law requires manual workers to be paid weekly and gives examples of those workers as a mechanic, a working man, or a laborer who spends more than 25% of working time engaged in physical labor. The question is, are the workers at a Dairy Queen involved in physical labor? So one of the sisters remembered how shocked they were when the 2019 case turned into a flood of lawsuits, which came to $6 million in losses for them. She said it was ridiculous to us because we knew we paid every employee every dime they were owed. Everyone we'd spoken to was like, this can't be right. You must be reading it wrong. There's something wrong. It was so unbelievable. Now, the sisters were initially being sued by a former employee of theirs who anonymously claimed that they weren't paid properly for overtime. That claim then snowballed into a class action against the two, which accused them of very serious labor violations against employees, including withholding paychecks without reason, refusing to pay overtime wages, and shifts in excess of 10 hours without legal compensation. Now, those allegations are different than the frequency law. And the question is, if that's true, that's a whole different thing. But it appears that the bulk of what's going on here was, it turns out there really was a law in New York that said certain people must get weekly paychecks. So the sisters denied the allegations and believed that the first claim was made because of one employee's anger over being terminated. A sister said that the woman told them, "I'm going to get you." And she did. So before long, that class action was made up of thousands of separate cases, according to a labor law expert and partner with a law firm. Now, the question is, how many cases could there be? Because how many employees did they have at this Dairy Queen? But I guess this goes back to 2019, and I'm not sure how long they had the Dairy Queen prior to that, or before that, as non-lawyers say. And the attorney says it took what was a law that required you to pay your employees weekly into more of a gotcha based on a technical violation. The sisters sought to change the law about pay frequency in New York, and a state senator took action and argued that the workers didn't need protection because they did get everything they were owed. Now, that action was shot down by the New York State Trial Lawyers Association, and a union spokesperson said that while what had happened to the sisters was horrible, the law is the law. So in May, the governor of New York closed the floodgate of lawsuits by making a change to the state legislation. She ordered businesses that pay every other week to now only owe the interest on the late wages. So if you pay every other week, you may have to pay interest for the first week, and so the law has been changed. But that did not solve all of these lawsuits. At one point, the sisters settled out of court for $450,000, but elsewhere it says $6 million. And I'm not sure if $6 million is cumulative, if they'd been hit with every single lawsuit, or if they settled for $450,000 for all the claims. Don't know. But now the sisters are seen by some people as heroes of New York business. So the claimants, the people who are involved in the class action lawsuit, stand to earn about $200 each. $200 each. And it does say here that $305,000 is going to cover lawyer fees. Now, that I suspect is not accurate. I suspect that the $305,000 is covering costs and lawyer fees, and there might have been costs involved that would make that number go up. But certainly $200 per person is not exactly a gigantic windfall. So the sisters have set up a GoFundMe to help them get back on their feet, and they called the whole situation an expensive lesson. And it turns out they've raised a few $1,000s as of the time this article was written. But the article says they were hit with a $6 million fine, but the way the law was written, it says that there are certain employees in the state of New York who must be paid weekly. Weekly. And if you don't pay them weekly, they can come after you and sue you. And it's one of those laws where the state doesn't enforce it. They leave it up to plaintiffs to enforce it on their own. There's a lot of laws out there like that. And apparently the law has been on the books since the Depression. Now, interestingly, I started thinking back on my own life, how many jobs I've had where I got paid every other week. And there have been quite a few. And I also had some where I got paid every week. And I never stopped to think about that all that much. So I can tell you that when I became a lawyer, at one point in time, I became an employer, meaning that I had people working for me, okay? So when I first became a lawyer, not the case, later on, hired people, makes me an employer. And so I just, every other week, paycheck every 2 weeks. And that's how most of my jobs have been. In fact, I have mentioned before I worked at a radio station early in my career, WLEW in Bad Axe, Michigan, got paid every 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, you go in and get a paycheck. And I've never heard of this law, but of course, I don't know how many states have got laws similar to it. But you can imagine that there was a time when, during the Depression, people were working really, really hard, just trying to get by, and it might be difficult to make it 2 weeks without pay, 2 weeks without pay. And so they passed a law saying you got to pay people weekly in certain circumstances. I'm surprised the law is not more widely publicized, however, because I'm sure you've also seen those posters on the wall at the workplace. And it'll say things like, here are some of your rights. What happens if you work overtime? What happens if you work holidays? That kind of stuff. And so the fact that this law is out there and so few people know about it is kind of surprising. But the law did get changed. Now, the law still says you're supposed to pay certain workers weekly, but if you don't, the penalty is not this punitive situation where you get hit with all kinds of fines and so on. It's basically you're going to owe interest on that money, and it's nowhere near as bad a situation. So, again, there was a settlement for $450,000 that resolved the case, but it does say at one point they were looking at $6 million of potential liability. The headline says a fine, but a fine, of course, would be, in most people's understanding, levied by the state or a state agency. You hear about that from time to time also, where a state agency will come into a workplace and fine the employers for something. But that's not what was going on here. So crazy case, all of this at a Dairy Queen. And I do live streams on Sundays, 1 o'clock Eastern time, right here on this channel. And somebody raised the issue regarding this story and mentioned Dairy Queen. And it's kind of funny because Dairy Queen's been around for a million years. And I always kind of forget they exist because most of the ice cream places I go to, and I do go to them. I love taking my car out, driving out someplace, going to an ice cream place. It's a nice destination, in the summertime. But I like to, walk up the window, get the ice cream, then kind of go sit someplace and eat the ice cream. And Dairy Queens are usually more, sit inside. And you got to go there, and they're quite often in an area with other buildings and stuff, and it's not the same ambiance. And I don't know why, but I've always been kind of surprised that Dairy Queens are still around because I know that they started out as an ice cream place, but then they've tried to branch out into like things like hamburgers and French fries and so on. But who thinks of Dairy Queen when it comes to that? However, these sisters bought the Dairy Queen. It was their thing. And unfortunately, it turned into them to just be this gigantic nightmare over a little-known New York law regarding how often you pay your workers. So everyone who sent that, thank you very much. From thesun.com, James Evenden wrote that. The headline says Dairy Queen owners hit with $6 million fine over a little-known pay law they never knew about. And of course, like I said, I think that was more of an exposure to legal liability, but it cost them $450,000. Questions or comments? Put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. It's the damage that we do and never know. It's the words we don't say that scare me so.